So today I'm returning to the roots of this channel and talking about White Forest. If you're new to the channel, I try to have a competitive angle on all of my videos, and I also try to be a little bit more creative and cover stuff that you might not see in typical meta profiles and that type of stuff. So right now I'm continuing a series of videos where I talk about how well positioned in the current meta and looking forward into the future of Yu-Gi-Oh! A given deck is. So White Forest has a lot of interesting things to talk about, and I want to first set the scene and talk about what it means to be a good deck versus well positioned. So a good deck is something like Yubel, where last format, a lot of people would say that Yubel was the best deck in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! And this format, nothing has really changed in terms of the power level of Yubel, or even necessarily the power level of Yubel relative to other decks that it's playing against. But Yubel is far more poorly positioned into the major driving forces of the meta right now. So Mulcharmy Fuelos is basically number one. And because we have popular decks like Tenpai, Shifter is also up there as one of the major driving forces of the meta. Next to those things, you have cards like Droll and Lockbird, which maybe is a little bit less popular than those other cards, or at least people think that it's not as powerful. Which is one of the things that makes Droll more popular, especially is when people think it's not as popular, then they play into it. To a lesser degree, you have Mulcharmy Purulia, which is more good against particular types of decks. Because Fire is so popular, I would say that Purulia is absolutely like a side deck staple still, unless you're playing a deck like Mermail that can benefit from it being a water that also has the right stats to be revived by Coral Anemone. That's another conversation. And then you have cards like Dimensional Barrier that are worth honorable mention because they're kind of like a counter to stuff like Fuelos in standby, Shifter in standby, that type of stuff, because you can debarrier off of Thrust, and then you have a chance to turn skip them the same way that they turn skipped you. A super extra honorable mention further down the list is Dogwood, which you're probably familiar with because last meta and maybe the meta before, this card gained a huge amount of popularity because people found out they could not turn skip in the way that you can with debarrier depending on the matchup, but you can survive another turn. And because Yu-Gi-Oh! Is so fast, being able to survive an extra turn, if you can actually win on the crackback or at least turn the game into a grind instead of an instant loss, this card is really worth consideration based on the type of deck that you're playing. But bottom line is Mulcharmy Fuelos, D-Shifter, and then Droll and Purulia after that are the driving forces of the meta. So if you're playing Yubel right now, you suffer against Fuelos and you suffer against Shifter, despite being possibly the best engine in Yu-Gi-Oh! Right now. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you have a deck like Centurion, which has an engine that is far, far worse than any Fire deck or Yubel, but is far better positioned into the meta because they only search once with their core engine, so the core engine doesn't lose to Droll. They will give you one draw if you hit them with Fuelos, or one draw if you hit them with Purulia, and don't really care too much about those major driving forces of the meta. So those are two solid examples of really good engine, really bad positioning, and then really good positioning and substandard engine. So where does White Forest fall into this spectrum of how good is the deck versus how well positioned is the deck? First of all, let's talk about the version of White Forest that I've chosen to talk about. Now, recently, unfortunately, there haven't really been much results in terms of major tournaments, people topping with White Forest, and it's still the case that Runic is the most represented by far version of White Forest that does top events. Now, unfortunately, Runic has some of the same problems as the other White Forest builds do in terms of how it plays into other stuff and its positioning. But this is my favorite version of the deck because the Wanted engine works really well with the toy cards, and so playing a large toy engine makes a lot of sense when you're playing this type of stuff because the Witch does trigger the Soldier and the Tank, for example. Also, being able to play power spells instead of having to force a ton of low impact non-engine like the standard low impact hand traps feels better in this type of deck because you have more spells and traps for potential discards if you're in a situation where you don't have an optimal discard, like something off of Box or the Woes or Tails or whatever. And also because Thrust in particular can search blowout cards like D-Barrier. Different Dimension Ground is one of the best cards to search off of Thrust, but that card really hurts us because we like to play on their turn too, that you have to like basically do nothing and hope DDG solos their turn. So D-Barrier and maybe Daruma are good examples of solid Thrust targets that can help you survive a turn if you get hit by something like a Shifter or a Fuelos. So I kind of prefer this version of the deck. There is one other tweak that you could make to this where you play a much larger Fiendsmith engine with, for example, like at least 2 Engraver, a Lacrima, 1 or 2 Tract, and a Luri. And in that case, you would need to add in a Sequence and a Desiree into your extra deck. In that case, the 3 cards that you could consider cutting are the Gallant Granite, the Draco Berserker, and the Sol. But I kind of like this version because I think that playing around breakers with Desiree is not as important in this deck, especially if you do the Nib Veiler combo, so where you search the Veiler off of the Arciela and you search the Nib off of the Gallant Granite. That's a very, very easy combo to make almost every single game. And this plays around breakers by being interactions that are in your hand as opposed to somewhere on your field, whether it's in your monster zone or your spell and trap zone. So I don't think that this deck has huge issues playing around breakers, and there are also ways to play around stuff like evenly matched, where I've shown in the side deck you can play stuff like Chaos Allure Queen. So I've shown this combo before, so I'm not going to show it off here. You can just look up my previous video if you want. So you can search the Chaos Allure Queen in this deck, and this card can special summon out Allure Queen level 3, and because this is a level 3, you can make Dawn Dragster, FA Dawn Dragster, which is a level 7, and that's a spell or trap negate. So this deck actually has tons of options for stuff that you can put in the side deck, and the Allure Queen package is a very, very solid way of doing that. I've also shown another combo where you can do the Buster Lock, where you equip the Buster Whelp to the Allure Queen, and you've Buster Locked your opponent, and then that is on top of the Allure Queen level 3 thing that goes into the FA Dawn Dragster and whatever the rest of your board is. So basically, this deck has lots of different ways of being played. This is kind of my favorite version. I like the Sol. I like playing Debtors. This card is also optional though. It does make your ratios slightly worse because you don't want to draw this unless the rest of your hand is good. You generally prefer to search this, but it does allow you to do stuff like make Sol on your opponent's turn, and it helps with your resource economy. So in terms of how well this engine is able to accomplish the things that it wants to accomplish, I would say that this is a very consistent deck that has a very, very high ceiling, and it's maybe even better than Fire King in terms of the quality of combinations that can exist in your hand. For example, if you're playing Fire King, you're going to have cards like the old Garunix, or, I mean, the new Garunix is not as bad to draw, but you have cards like the old Garunix that you don't really want to draw. You don't necessarily want to draw the new Garunix either, even though you can make it work. A lot of your combos usually revolve around accessing one-ofs from your deck like Arvata, and sometimes your combo lines can become a little bit awkward if you draw some of those cards. Also, you can draw, like a Fire King Island or a Sanctuary, and then it makes it feel like your Ponic Search is a little bit less valuable. If you choose the main cards like Skyburn, those are also cards that you would generally prefer to search, unless you're in a particular type of game state where you want to use this really quickly. And so, I feel like, even though this is a multi-card combo deck and it's not like Snake Eyes where you can just draw a single Ash, or like Snake Eye Ash or Bonfire or whatever and do full combo, because there are enough high quality cards you can play in combination together, the deck generally works very consistently and can put out very, very consistent, very powerful boards with very diversified locations of interactions, like Nib Veiler in hand, Woes set on field, something like access to a Diabell that can go into a Zapper Shrimp and a Chaos Angel. So the interactions are quite layered. You'll always have your tuners in the grave to shuffle back, one of these and then go into something else on your opponent's turn. So I would say that the power level of the deck is maybe not as good as Snake Eye or the Fire decks right now, or Yubel. And that's really just because you still do need combinations of cards, and even though it's likely that you'll have good combinations of cards, the fact that your cards don't by themselves, like a Bonfire or a Snake Eyes Ash, do literally everything in your entire deck, the deck is just inherently worse than those decks. But that doesn't make it a bad deck. It makes it probably a solid tier 2 contender in terms of just engine power. So what about how well positioned this deck is? This is the problem right now, and this is the reason that you haven't seen this deck topping. And this deck actually loses to almost every single relevant driving force in the meta right now. So Mulcharmy Fool Loss is horrendous to play against with this deck, because you like to summon a lot of times. Even if you play the Runic variant, don't be fooled by it having Runic in the name. That is basically a combo deck. You're going to summon at least one Hugin just as part of your combo, and you're going to, at least at a bare minimum, ladder into Diabell, and that's the basic board. If you're able to play uninterrupted, you would actually prefer to go into something else like a Cheng Ying maybe, and then also the Diabell on top of that. And so you've given your opponent far too many draws for that to be a viable strategy. If you only play with the runic stuff because you got, you know, Fu Lost or whatever, then you may have a couple dead cards in your hand. The White Forest cards also lose very, very heavily to Perulia, and unfortunately Perulia has not left the meta because Fu Lost exists. Instead, Perulia is kind of relegated to the side deck, and Fu Lost is usually in the main, or at the very least in the side deck. And so after game 1, you could be facing up against 6 Mulcharmies in the deck with both Fu Lost and Perulia sided in, and you can't beat either of those cards. Then if you want to talk about Droll, this deck likes to search a lot. I have made a combo video before talking about how to play around Droll. If you do want to watch that, you can skip the first combo because it's really the rest that are realistic. You can do stuff like holding your first search until you make a Rafflesia, and I'll just bring the card up. So Gravedigger's Trap Hole can negate a monster effect that was activated in the hand or grave. And so this can stop stuff like Nib, but also Droll. And so if you immediately make a Rafflesia before you've gone into your searches or whatever, and then they try to Droll you, you can then Gravedigger's Trap Hole the Droll. This type of stuff actually is realistic. Like you can actually make it, you know, if you build your deck so you can consistently make a rank 4 XYZ before you start your plays, you would probably just increase the number of, for example, like Sylvies and Rusias in your deck to guarantee that you could go into that rank 4 before doing the rest of your plays. It's actually not hard to do, but the problem is Droll is just one of those cards that you have to be worried about, and is also probably one of the least relevant ones, just because Fu Lost and Perulia are almost guaranteed to be in everyone's deck, whether or not it's in the side. This deck also can't really play around Shifter, so it's like if you're losing to Fu Lost, you're losing to Perulia, you're losing to Droll, you're losing to Shifter, and then the people that are also playing the D-Barriers and the Thrusts in their deck to counter those cards, especially if they don't lose to them as hard as you do, you're also going to get shifted for, you know, Synchro. And then what? You have to try to play a kind of like a weird Fiendsmith or Azamina line when you can't ladder. And then your ability to do those things is also hurt, because normally what you would do in a typical White Forest line is you want to go through your Synchro stuff first, and that gives you resources like the Tuner in the Grave that can bring itself back out to make your other plays, just for example. And so the ways that you have to play around these types of things are very, very awkward. Then if you think about like some other recent additions to the deck, like Scourge of the White Forest, this gives the deck even better ability to play through breakers, like evenly matched. So, you know, playing the Allure Queen package just to go into FA Dawn Dragster isn't mandatory, because you have in-engine ways to out stuff like the evenly matched. And then if you want, you can still make Dawn Dragster or build your deck in that way if you want. And that's great. It's very, very strong. And if breakers were the main consideration, like if we were facing up against like Dark Ruler and evenly matched or Droplet every single game, then this deck would be extremely well positioned to take on those types of non-engine cards. But that's not the meta that we're in. And so I feel like, unfortunately, this is not the time for White Forest to shine. Looking into the future, we have crossover breakers coming up, and that is potentially a shifter format. We have to see when exactly they're going to release the next ban list, but probably, if I had to guess, crossover breakers will come out before a ban list. They'll wait to see how the meta shapes up and then decide what to hit. And if we have stuff like Fire and Yubel that are still relevant, it's pretty likely that Malice and, most importantly, Ryzeal will be maybe even maining Shifter, and that's really just to stop Yubel and those meta decks from playing properly, and we will lose to that deck. So, and Ryzeal is also a deck that has solid one-card starters. It's kind of like the new Sprite, like the rank 4 version of Sprite. It doesn't have a super high skill floor, so it's, you know, not the most difficult thing to pilot, and also you can play broken stuff like Shifter. So it's kind of unclear to me when exactly White Forest would shine. Obviously there are, you know, like very strong broken lines where you can get access to Jowgen and that type of stuff and you can lock your opponent out, but realistically speaking, if you want to be competitive, you have to think about how your deck plays into those types of cards, and this is really not the format for it. So what are my conclusions from all this? I think that you can definitely play this at a local level, and You probably could take it to a major event, but you shouldn't expect to top just because you are going to have to fight against those major cards all of the time. So yeah, basically this is actually a very strong deck in terms of how the engine works. You can successfully combine the Deception package, all the Azumina cards, and the Fiendsmith stuff, and they work very, very well with these cards even before Supreme Darkness when Azumina Elzec comes out. I have a gameplay video on that. If you want to check it out, you can look at my channel for it. So this definitely does work, but it doesn't work against the stuff that matters right now. So those are my thoughts on White Forest. I will still probably put out some more gameplay on this because people tend to enjoy that. If you have any suggestions, let me know. If you want to join the Discord, the link will be in the description. Thanks for watching.